This is my true story. I gave my life to my son, my time, my money, my health. I thought one day he would look at me with pride and gratitude, but instead he looked at me with hate. In a moment of anger, he called me something I will never forget: a curse. Those words cut me deeper than any wound I have ever known. But what he didn't realize was that I carried a truth that could destroy him, and I used it. Before I tell you what I did, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. And please subscribe so my stories reach more people. From the day my son was born, I made him my reason for living. I wasn't a rich man, not even close, but I had strong hands and a strong will, and I promised myself that everything I earned would go toward giving him a better life. I worked in factories, in the sun, in the rain, in places where my back bent and my body ached, but I never once thought of quitting. Each coin I brought home, each meal I put on the table, each school fee I paid, they were all for him. I believed that one day, when I grew old and weak, the respect I had earned through sacrifice would be returned through his love. When he was young, I often went hungry so he wouldn't have to. I would pretend I wasn't hungry, pushing my plate toward him, telling him to eat more because he was still growing. In truth, it was my stomach that growled through the night, but I silenced it with pride. Seeing him fed and strong was enough for me. When school trips came up, when new shoes were needed, when books cost more than my wages for the week, I didn't hesitate. I picked up extra shifts, wiped sweat from my forehead, and told myself, this is what fathers do. As he grew older, I did more than just feed and clothe him. I invested in his dreams. When he said he wanted to go to university, I worked double shifts to pay his tuition. I wore the same old clothes year after year, patched at the elbows, while I made sure he looked sharp and presentable. When he wanted to start his career, I gave him introductions from the few contacts I had built over the years. Men who respected me agreed to meet with him because I asked. Every door I could open for him, I opened, even if it meant closing opportunities for myself. Even after I retired, I didn't stop helping him. My pension wasn't much, but whenever he asked for money, to help with bills, to cover emergencies, to invest in opportunities he swore were golden, I gave it. I never once asked for repayment. My advice, too, was always his to take. Sometimes he listened, sometimes he brushed me off, but I always offered it. I told myself that one day, when my steps grew slower and my body gave out, he would be there for me. He would carry me the way I had carried him. I didn't dream of riches. I didn't dream of glory. My dream was simple: to sit quietly in my old age, watching my grandchildren play, knowing that my son respected me, knowing that he saw me as more than just a provider, as a father who gave him everything. Respect, I thought, was the least I would get in return. But I was wrong. The boy I raised with my sweat and sacrifice grew into a man who no longer saw me as his foundation. Instead, he began to see me as a burden, an old man whose worth had expired. The bond I thought unbreakable began to rot, slowly at first, until one day it shattered completely. Disrespect doesn't always arrive in shouts. Sometimes it creeps in quietly, hidden in jokes, in tones, in glances that sting more than words. That is how it began with my son. At first it was small, a chuckle when I forgot something, a sigh when I moved too slowly, a smirk when I offered advice about money or life. I told myself not to take it to heart. I thought he was just stressed, just tired, just being careless with his words. But slowly those small things grew sharper. The man I had raised with sacrifice no longer spoke to me as a son speaks to a father. He spoke to me as if I were a burden chained to his life. He started mocking my health. When I coughed or struggled to climb the stairs, he would roll his eyes. Once, when I sat down to catch my breath, he looked at me and said, "You're falling apart, old man. You should be grateful we even keep you around." He laughed afterward, as if it were a joke, but there was no humor in it for me. Those words sank into my chest like stones. Every time I offered him advice, he dismissed me. If I told him to save money, he smirked and said, "You wouldn't understand." This isn't your time anymore. If I warned him not to trust certain people, he laughed and told others, "My dad still thinks the world runs the way it did 50 years ago." People chuckled with him, but I sat quietly, my heart breaking a little more each time. The bond of family began to rot into bitterness. When I walked into the room, sometimes he would fall silent, as if my presence was an annoyance. When bills came, he would mutter that he carried the weight of two families, his own and me. He didn't say it outright, but I heard the truth in his tone. To him, I was a problem, an extra mouth, a shadow clinging to his life. The worst part was the way he mocked me in front of others. Once, at a family gathering, I tried to share a story from my youth, a memory of how I worked 3 jobs at once to buy him his first bicycle. I thought it was a story of pride, a reminder of the love I poured into him. But before I could finish, he cut me off. "You always talk about how hard you worked," he said loudly, rolling his eyes. "Maybe if you were smarter, you wouldn't have had to struggle so much. Times are different now." People laughed awkwardly, not knowing what to say. I smiled weakly, pretending I wasn't hurt, but inside I felt like my chest had been split open. It wasn't just the words. It was the way he looked at me, not as a father, not even as a man, but as something old, weak, and in the way. His eyes no longer carried warmth. They carried irritation, as though every breath I took was one breath too many. I tried to ignore it. I told myself he was under pressure, that stress made him cruel, that deep down he still loved me. I clung to the memories of the boy who once held my hand, the boy who once cried when I was sick, the boy who once told me he wanted to be like me. But that boy was gone. In his place stood a man who saw me as little more than an inconvenience. The disrespect grew heavier each day, like a weight pressing down on my chest. I thought I could endure it. I had endured poverty, hunger, pain. But the pain of being disrespected by your own blood is heavier than all of that combined. And I didn't know then that the worst words were still to come. Words that would cut deeper than any mockery. Words that would leave me standing silent, broken inside. It happened one evening. The kind of evening that begins like any other, with the ordinary rhythm of life. I was sitting at the table, quietly sipping tea, when my son came home, his face tight with frustration. He slammed his keys down and muttered under his breath about problems at work, bills piling up, and how nothing ever goes right. I sat there, watching him pace, and after a long silence, I tried to comfort him. I spoke softly, as fathers do, reminding him that struggles pass, that patience and honesty build solutions. I thought my words would ease him, the way they once had when he was a boy. But instead, he turned to me with eyes that were not my son's anymore. "What do you know?" he snapped. "You sit here every day, old and useless. You don't understand what it's like to carry the weight of a family. You've been nothing but a burden since the day I can remember." I froze, his words hitting me like a blow to the chest. I wanted to defend myself, but before I could open my mouth, he shouted louder, his anger spilling over into venom. "You're nothing but a curse. Ever since you came into my life, everything went wrong. Time seemed to stop. His voice echoed in my ears, but my body felt numb. A curse. That was what he saw when he looked at me. Not a father, not the man who had raised him, not the man who had given him everything I had, but a curse, a weight, a mistake. My teacup slipped from my hand and shattered on the floor, but I didn't move to clean it. I just sat there, staring at him, my lips trembling but no words escaping. For the first time in my life, I had no answer, no strength. Betrayal I could survive. Disrespect I could endure. But those words, those cruel words, pierced deeper than anything I had ever faced. He didn't stop. He muttered under his breath, pacing, repeating that I was nothing, that my presence poisoned his life, that he would be better off without me. Every word stripped me bare. It was not just anger, it was truth in his eyes. He meant it. I wanted to scream, I wanted to tell him of the nights I went hungry so he could eat, of the mornings I walked to work in shoes with holes so he could wear new ones to school, of the sacrifices I made so he could have a future. I wanted to remind him that his very life was built from the pieces of mine I had broken to build him up. But the words would not come. My throat closed, my heart pounded, and my body sat still, paralyzed by the weight of his cruelty. When he finally stormed out of the room, leaving me alone with the broken cup and the broken silence, I sat there for what felt like hours. My chest ached as if a knife had been lodged in it. I looked at the empty chair across from me and remembered when he was a boy, sitting there swinging his legs, smiling up at me, asking questions about the world. That boy was gone. In his place stood a man who had just called his father a curse. I stayed silent. Not because I agreed, not because I was weak, but because the pain was too heavy to carry in words. I held it inside, letting it burn, letting it cut, letting it scar. And in that silence, something inside me shifted. Something broke. Yes, but something also hardened. Because I realized that night that the man who called me a curse had forgotten one thing. I knew the truth about him. A truth darker than the words he threw at me. And though I sat silent that night, my silence would not last forever. That night, after he called me a curse, I sat alone in the dim light of my room. The walls felt tighter than ever, pressing in on me, as though they too had heard the words and were ashamed to hold me. I didn't move for hours. I just sat there, staring at my hands, the same hands that had carried bricks, lifted tools, and built a life so my son could grow without hunger or fear. Now those hands trembled, not from age, but from the weight of betrayal. I replayed every sacrifice I had made, one by one, as if each memory was a knife twisting in my chest. I remembered the nights I worked double shifts while my body begged for rest, just so I could pay his tuition on time. I remembered the mornings I went to work without breakfast so he could have a full plate before school. I remembered watching him walk away in polished shoes, knowing I had worn mine until they split apart, because his dignity meant more to me than my comfort. And now, after all of that, the son I gave everything to had looked me in the eyes and told me I was a curse. Not just a burden, not just a problem, a curse, a poison in his life. I wept silently, my tears soaking into my shirt, but soon even the tears dried. There comes a point when the body cannot cry anymore, when pain becomes heavier than water. I sat in the dark, dry-eyed, hollow, humiliated. I thought of the neighbors, of relatives, of friends. If they ever heard those words, what would they say? That the old man had become nothing but bad luck? That perhaps I deserved it? Shame wrapped itself around me like a chain, each link forged from the son I had raised. But in that silence, something else began to stir. I thought of every time I had been mocked for being old-fashioned, every time my advice was dismissed, every time he made me feel like a shadow in his house. Each insult was a stone he had laid, building a wall between us. And that night, with those cruel words, he had sealed the wall completely. There was no going back. Yet, as much as it hurt, I also felt something change inside me. For years, I had swallowed my pride, telling myself patience was love, telling myself silence was strength. But silence had brought me nothing but humiliation. Silence had allowed him to believe that he could treat me however he wished without consequence. And as I sat there, replaying the life I had given and the man he had become, I realized something. I was not weak. I was not useless. And I was not a curse. No, the real curse was his betrayal, his lies, his arrogance, and I knew something he thought I had long forgotten. I knew his secret, the affair he had hidden, the double life he thought no one noticed. I had stayed silent about it, convincing myself it wasn't my place, convincing myself it was better to protect the family than to reveal the truth. But now, after being called a curse, that silence felt like weakness. That night, humiliation dried into something harder. Resolve. If he could look me in the eyes and spit on every sacrifice I made, then I could look him in the eyes and tear away the mask he wore before the world. He thought I was powerless. He thought I was finished. But he had forgotten that even in age, truth is a weapon. And I carried it. I went to bed that night not at peace, but no longer broken. I had no more tears left for him. Only a plan forming quietly in my heart. For years, I had carried a truth about my son that no father should ever have to carry. I knew about his affair. It wasn't because I went looking for it. It was because truth has a way of showing itself, even when you don't want to see it. He thought he was clever, careful, untouchable. But when you live long enough, you learn to read people. You learn to hear the lies tucked between their words, to see the shadows behind their smiles. And I saw them. It began with the late-night calls. He would step outside with his phone pressed tightly to his ear, lowering his voice so I couldn't hear. But walls have ears, and silence carries sound. I heard the softness in his tone, a tone he never used with his wife. I heard the laughter, the promises, the words no married man should speak to someone who isn't his wife. At first, I told myself not to assume. I told myself perhaps it was business, but the way his face changed when he hung up told me otherwise. Then came the trips. Business, he called them, always business. Trips that left his wife alone for days, caring for the children while he was closing deals. But the receipts told another story. Receipts from hotels far outside his supposed destinations. Receipts for dinners for two when he claimed to be eating alone. Receipts tucked away carelessly in his pockets, as though he believed no one would ever bother to look. I found them when I did his laundry once, and my heart sank. I also remembered the nights he came home smelling of perfume that wasn't his wife's. Subtle at first, but unmistakable. I said nothing. I watched his wife kiss him at the door, smiling, believing his stories, and I swallowed my words. Because I told myself silence was loyalty. Silence was protecting the family. But over time, the truth became impossible to ignore. I had even seen him once, though he never knew it. One afternoon, when he claimed to be at work, I walked past a cafe downtown. Through the window, there he was, laughing, leaning close to a woman who was not his wife, his hand on hers as if the world belonged only to them. My chest tightened, my stomach churned, and I turned away quickly, ashamed to have seen it. I carried that image for years, burying it deep inside me. I convinced myself he would grow out of it, that he would realize the value of the woman waiting at home for him, the woman who had built his life beside him. I stayed silent because I believed protecting the marriage was protecting the family. I thought silence was love. But the night he called me a curse, that silence felt like chains. Chains he had wrapped around me with every lie, every betrayal, every moment of arrogance. He had mocked me for being old, dismissed me as useless, discarded me as if my life had no value. And now he had spit the word curse into my face. That night, I realized something. Silence was no longer loyalty. Silence was weakness. I knew then that the affair I had hidden for him would no longer stay hidden. If he could strip me of dignity with his words, then I would strip him of the mask he wore before the world. He thought he could deceive his wife forever. He thought he could play the role of faithful husband while living a lie. But truth, no matter how long it sleeps, always wakes up. And I was the one who would wake it. I gathered the pieces I had kept without realizing why. The receipts, the photos I had taken quietly of the strange charges, the memories of his late-night calls. I carried them not as a father anymore, but as a man who had been betrayed. A man who knew the only way to restore his dignity was to expose the truth. That night, as I sat with the folder of proof in my lap, I whispered to myself, "He called me a curse, but the only curse is his betrayal. And I will break it." Revenge doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, patient and precise, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. After the night he called me a curse, I sat in silence for days, letting the words settle like stones in my chest. But as heavy as they were, I knew I could not carry them forever. The more I replayed his cruelty, the clearer my mind became. He thought I was powerless. He thought age had made me weak. But what he forgot is that I still held something stronger than fists or wealth. I held the truth. The first step was to gather everything I had kept, whether on purpose or by accident. I opened the small box where I had tucked away receipts that didn't add up, notes I had made when I overheard his lies, and even a photo I had taken once when he wasn't looking. A photo of him sitting in a cafe with the woman who wasn't his wife, his hand resting on hers as if the world belonged only to them. I laid each piece of evidence on the table, my heart pounding with both shame and determination. Shame that he was my son. Determination that the lies he lived in would finally crumble. I organized everything carefully, page by page, like a man building a case in court. Late-night hotel bills, fuel receipts that contradicted his business trips, text messages I had seen light up his phone when he thought I wasn't watching. For years, I had convinced myself these details didn't matter, that silence was love, that a father's duty was to protect. But now I saw them for what they really were, weapons. Still, I wasn't reckless. I knew shouting at him would solve nothing. He would deny it. He would twist the truth, gaslight me, and once again, I would be painted as the bitter old man who didn't understand. No, this strike had to be clean, precise. Delivered to the one person who deserved to see the truth more than anyone, his wife. She had stood by him for years, carrying his home, raising his children, trusting every word he said. She had smiled at him at the door when he came home late, believing his excuses, believing in his lies. She had been loyal where he had not. And she was the one living in the shadow of his betrayal, blind to what I had seen all along. If he called me a curse, then I would give her the truth, not out of spite for her, but out of justice for myself. Because she deserved to know, and he deserved to fall. As I sealed the evidence in an envelope, my hands did not shake, not from fear, not from doubt. For the first time in months, I felt steady, strong. The humiliation he had poured over me had hardened into something he could never break. Resolve. I whispered to myself as I held the envelope close. He called me a curse. But tomorrow, he will know what a curse really feels like. The plan was simple, quiet, no arguments, no shouting, just truth, delivered to the right hands. And once truth entered her home, his marriage, his life, nothing would ever be the same. The next morning, I rose earlier than usual. The house was still, but my heart was not. I had barely slept, yet I felt no weakness. I had something far stronger pushing me forward. Purpose. The envelope lay on the table, thick with the weight of years of silence, thick with the evidence of lies. I held it in my hand, running my fingers across its edges, and whispered to myself, "This is not revenge alone. This is justice." I waited until my son left for work. His wife, my daughter-in-law, was in the kitchen, preparing breakfast for the children. She looked tired, her hair tied back carelessly, her eyes heavy from nights spent keeping the house together while he was off working late. I had always admired her quiet strength. She had been loyal, patient, trusting, perhaps too trusting, and she was the one who deserved the truth most. I stepped into the kitchen. She looked up and smiled faintly, a smile of politeness, of habit, not of joy. "Good morning," she said softly. "Good morning," I replied. My voice was calm, though inside me storms raged. I reached into my coat and pulled out the envelope. My hand did not tremble. My eyes did not waver. I placed it gently on the table before her. She frowned, confused. "What is this?" I met her gaze, my voice steady, stripped of anger, stripped of hesitation. "The truth," I said, "about your husband." She hesitated, her hands hovering over the envelope as though it might burn her. I could see the flicker of fear in her eyes, the quiet knowing of a woman who has long suspected but never dared to confirm. Her lips parted, but no words came. I leaned forward slightly, speaking softly but firmly. He called me a curse. He said I was poison in his life. But the real curse is the lies he has buried in this house. And you deserve to know them. Her hands finally touched the envelope. She pulled it closer, her fingers trembling as she opened the flap. I didn't stay to watch her read. It wasn't my place to witness her heartbreak. My role was only to deliver the truth. The truth I had carried too long, the truth he thought would remain hidden forever. I turned and walked toward the door. Behind me, I heard the faint rustle of paper, the sharp intake of her breath as she saw the receipts, the photos, the proof of his betrayal laid bare before her eyes. I didn't need to hear her words. I didn't need to see her tears. I knew what the truth would do. As I stepped outside into the cold morning air, I felt lighter. For months, I had been carrying humiliation like chains around my neck. For years, I had carried silence like a burden I could not drop. But now, with one quiet act, I had shifted the weight where it belonged, onto him. I whispered to myself as I closed the door behind me. He called me a curse. But I have given his wife the truth, and the truth will curse him more than any words ever could. It did not take long for the storm to begin. By the afternoon, the house was no longer quiet. I had gone for a walk to clear my head, and as I returned, I heard voices inside. Voices not of calm conversation, but of rage, shock, and heartbreak. My daughter-in-law's cries echoed through the walls, sharp and raw, and my son's voice thundered in denial, in anger, in desperation. The confrontation I had known would come had begun. She had the envelope spread across the table, the receipts, the photographs, the messages, all the lies made visible. I stood just outside the doorway, listening as her voice, usually so soft and patient, roared like fire. "How long?" she demanded. "How long have you been lying to me? How long have you been sneaking around while I carried this family on my back?" My son stammered, his arrogance stripped away. "It's not what it looks like. Those receipts, those trips, they don't mean what you think." His words fell weak, hollow, because the evidence was undeniable. His excuses collided against the hard wall of truth, and truth did not move. "You promised me," she screamed. "You promised me loyalty. You promised me honesty, and all these years, you've been nothing but a liar." I heard the sound of paper scattering, the sharp crack of a glass hitting the floor. My son's voice rose higher, trying to regain control, but every word he spoke only exposed his guilt further. He shouted at her for snooping, for listening to others, for believing lies. But the proof wasn't mine anymore. It was hers, and she held it with both hands like a sword. Relatives were called. Within hours, the living room filled with family, cousins, uncles, aunts, neighbors who had heard the shouting. They came with questions, but soon they needed no answers. She laid out the evidence for all to see, her tears streaking down her face as she pointed at the man she had once trusted with her life. "Here is your golden son," she spat bitterly. "Here is the man you all respected. A liar, a cheat, a fraud." The whispers grew into judgment. The respect he once commanded in that room vanished like smoke. His proud posture crumbled. He stood hunched, his hands shaking, his eyes darting around the room searching for support. But there was none. The same relatives who once praised him now turned their faces away. Some muttered curses under their breath, others shook their heads in disgust. His wife, her voice breaking but steady, said the words that struck harder than anything I could have delivered. "We are done. This marriage is over. You don't just betray me. You betray everyone who believed in you." And with that, she tore the wedding ring from her finger and slammed it onto the table. The sound of it hitting the wood rang louder than any of his excuses. My son's face drained of color. For the first time in his life, he looked small, cornered, powerless. The man who once called me a curse was now cursed by his own actions, standing in the ruins of the life he had built on lies. I stayed in the doorway, unseen by most, watching silently. I didn't need to speak. The truth I had delivered had spoken louder than I ever could. His arrogance had shattered. His respect had burned away. His marriage, once his pride, lay in ashes. And as his wife walked past him, her head high despite her tears, leading the children out the door, my son collapsed into a chair, burying his face in his hands. The house, once filled with his laughter and arrogance, now echoed with silence, the silence of a man who had finally been exposed. The days after the confrontation were heavy, not with noise, but with silence. My son's house, once filled with the sound of his prideful voice, the laughter of children, the footsteps of a wife holding everything together, became hollow. His wife had left with the children, staying with her family, and the relatives who once praised him avoided his calls. What remained was a man stripped bare, pacing from room to room with nothing but anger and shame. But instead of facing his own betrayal, he turned his fury toward me. He stormed into my room one evening, his face red, his voice trembling with rage. "You!" he spat. "This is your doing. You destroyed my marriage. You poisoned her against me. You wanted to ruin me." I looked at him calmly, my hands folded in my lap. His words didn't pierce me the way they once did, because now I carried the armor of truth. I let him rage, let him shout, let him spit his accusations. And when he finally stopped, breathing hard, I spoke slowly. "I didn't ruin your marriage," I said. "You did. I didn't poison her against you. You poisoned your vows the day you chose lies over loyalty. All I did was place the truth where it belonged." He staggered back, his mouth opening as though to argue, but no words came. The truth silenced him more than anger ever could. He lowered his eyes, unable to meet mine, and for the first time I saw fear in his face. Not of me, but of the life he had destroyed with his own hands. Relatives came, one by one, and though he tried to twist the story, they would not believe him. He told them I had interfered, that I had plotted against him, but the evidence was too strong. His wife had shown them everything, the receipts, the photographs, the proof. No one could deny what he had done, and in their eyes, he was not the victim. He was the betrayer. One uncle told him coldly, "Don't blame your father. Blame yourself. A curse? The only curse here is the shame you've brought on your family." Those words cut him deeper than mine ever could. Neighbors whispered when they saw him in the street. Friends stopped calling. The man who once walked proudly, boasting of his successes, now moved quickly with his head down, as though hoping no one would see him. But people always see. People always remember. As for me, I no longer felt the sting of humiliation. The weight of being called a curse had lifted. The truth had turned the insult back on him, showing the world who the real curse was. I no longer needed to defend myself. The evidence had defended me. At night, I sat quietly, sipping tea, remembering the boy I once raised, the boy who clung to my hand and called me father. I mourned that boy because he was gone forever. But I no longer mourned the man he had become. For the first time in a long time, I felt peace. Not joy, not triumph, but peace. Because I knew one thing with certainty. He had tried to bury me with shame, but I had buried him with truth. Justice, I learned, doesn't always arrive in courtrooms or through police raids. Sometimes justice comes in the quiet collapse of lies, when the truth finally reaches the right ears and shatters the illusions a man has built around himself. That is what I witnessed in the aftermath. My son, who once stood tall, arrogant, and untouchable, now walked like a man carrying chains no one else could see. His marriage was gone, his respect was gone, and the mask he had worn for years had been ripped away for everyone to see. And I, the father he once called a curse, walked with dignity again. I didn't celebrate. There was no joy in watching my own blood fall apart. But there was peace, a deep, steady peace that comes when a man finally stands up after being trampled for too long. For years, I let him speak down to me, mock me, strip me of respect. I carried his insults in silence because I thought that was what fathers were meant to do. But silence, I realized, is not always love. Sometimes silence only feeds arrogance. And when he looked me in the eyes and called me a curse, He broke the last string holding my silence together. The truth had always been there, waiting. I had seen the late-night calls, the receipts, the secret meetings. I had held that knowledge close, thinking I was protecting my family by keeping it hidden. But in the end, the only thing I had been protecting was his lies. And lies don't deserve protection. They deserve exposure. The day I handed that envelope to his wife, I didn't just give her proof of his betrayal. I gave myself proof that I was not weak, that I was not useless, that I was not the curse he claimed I was. I was the truth teller, and the truth is stronger than any insult. The family that once wavered now looked at me differently. They saw not the old man my son mocked, but the father who had endured, the man who had carried the truth when no one else dared to. Respect returned, not in grand gestures, but in quiet nods, in softer tones, in the absence of pity. And that was enough for me. I lived the rest of my days not in wealth, not in comfort, but in peace. Because I had done what needed to be done. I had broken the curse, not the one my son spoke of, but the curse of betrayal that he carried within himself. He thought I would die with his insult carved into my heart. Instead, I left him to live with the truth carved into his life. Sometimes I wonder if he still hates me. Perhaps he does. Perhaps he always will. But hatred cannot change the truth, and lies cannot erase justice. He called me a curse. But in the end, it was his own betrayal that cursed him, not me. Final thought. He called me a curse, but the only curse was his betrayal, and I broke it.